Welcome back. I'm here to break down the second day of the EU Masters quarterfinals. Yesterday was another unpredictable day with the big favorite on the slate and for the tournament, Mouse Sports, going down at the hands of Rogue. And that's kind of been the nature of EU Masters thus far. We've seen a lot of unpredictability. Any team can come out on any day and win a match against any opponent. Uh, so, in looking at the slate today, I'm going to treat both of these matches as coin flips. Unfortunately, I don't have a strong read on which way I think either of these matches are going to go. So the early match between Movistar and Fnatic, that line is set as basically a coin flip. And then in the later match between Gamers Origin and Kick, Gamers Origin is set as a pretty big favorite there. Um, However, I think that line might move a bit, and just based on the talent of both of these teams and what we've seen so far in this tournament, I don't see any reason that it shouldn't be much closer to a coin flip here. Kick comes out of the Polish Ultraliga. That is the league that Rogue is from. And we just saw Rogue come out and stomp Mouse Sports, who was potentially supposed to win this tournament. So that's just another reason to think that Kick can handle business here potentially. Um, and on that note, even though Kick is the dog here, I think they could be fairly highly owned because uh, they've been kind of the darling of the tournament so far, and even when they've been the dog in their group stage matchups, we still saw pretty high ownership on them. So I think that the ownership overall today is fairly spread out between these four teams. You might even see inflated ownership on Fnatic and Kick because they're, the exciting teams that get lots of kills. But of course, if Movistar and Gamers Origin win their series, those are the teams that you need to be on to profit. So uh, I will have stacks with exposure to all four of these teams today, and I'm going to focus more on which players I think are in a position to score the most fantasy points if their team does win their series. So the focus of today's video is mainly going to be on specific players, and I'm going to jump into that in just a second. But before I do that, and looking at the metrics for these teams during the group stage, the big thing that does stand out to me is that you kind of have a clash of styles in both of these matchups because you have two teams that are fairly aggressive in Movistar and Kick, and then two teams that are a little more controlled in their style of play in Movistar and Gamers Origin. So the winner will really come down to who's able to impose their style on their opponent. But again, I just don't have a strong read on who's going to be able to do that. All right. One final thing before we move on to specific plays is that I do really like these two stats, tower differential 15 minutes in and gold differential 15 minutes in. The thing that stands out here is that Kick thus far has had about two more towers than their opponent 15 minutes in and a 2K gold lead. So if they're able to get out to quick starts like that today against Gamers Origin, I see no reason why they wouldn't be able to win this series. All right, let's jump into specific plays. And quickly, I'm going to go over what you're looking at here. I know it's probably a lot to take in. So this column here is the fantasy points that each player has scored in their team wins in the group stage. It does not include the 2-point bonus for 10 kills or assists, so the number is slightly lower than what you're going to see at on DK. But nonetheless, it serves as a great baseline of what to expect. The second column is what this team's opponent allowed to each position in losses during the group stage. This number here is the sample size. That's only 2 games in this case. Yes, that is a small sample size and not something to put a huge amount of stock into. And for that reason, I also added in here the amount of points that their opponent allowed to each position during the course of the season in their domestic league. So a much better sample size there. So basically, if we see a strong correlation between these two numbers, at least in the way they're distributed between position, that means it's something that is perhaps more reliable. And then finally, I averaged all three of those numbers to get a very rough idea of where the fantasy point production should come from if this team does win their series. And then those first three columns are just in a chart form over here. I think the blue bar is the most important to focus on because that's the DK points per win for each player in the group stage. And I think the reason I say that's the one to focus on is because if a team does win, I think it's because they're going to impose their style and their play, and it's going to focus on the players that they like to play around and get kills from. So that will be the primary driver for me, but I think it also is very helpful to see where their opponent has been weak because, of course, that is something they could exploit. All right, now that we know what we're looking at, let's go ahead and jump in here with the first team, Movistar. The ADC Java was the leading scorer for them in wins during the group stage. However, the mid Zico and the jungler Elyoya were not far behind in scoring. And the reason I think that's important is because Fnatic did really get hurt in the group stage by the jungler and mid position in their losses. Again, it's only 2 games, but if you look over the course of the season, they did allow nearly as many points to those positions as the ADC position. So I am potentially looking at Zico and Elyoya to have the upside to lead their team in fantasy points if Movistar does win. And since Java should be the highest owned from this team, there could be a bit of leverage in both of those players I just mentioned. All right, their opponent is Fnatic. The jungler, Dan, led the team in fantasy points and wins during the group stage. It's also worth noting that Pride, who plays the top position, was second on the team, which is really impressive. In terms of the weakness for Movistar, in their 2 losses during the group stage, they allowed the most points to the mid position. And over the course of their domestic season, they were allowing essentially the same amount of points to the mid and ADC position. So there is some good correlation right there. The only downside is that the mid for Fnatic, Magic Felix, hasn't been a super high upside player. He's been very consistent, right around 30 points in almost every win. However, perhaps today is a day where we see a little more upside out of him, just because that's where Movistar has been hurt, and I think he might go overlooked. So just something to consider there in terms of leverage. Obviously, the way Pride has been playing and scoring fantasy points, he's another good option as the second lowest priced player on Fnatic. And then finally, the sup or support, Bravado, has had some really high scoring games in the group stage. But something to look at is that this is actually a position that Movistar has limited the scoring for both in the EU Masters and over the course of their domestic season. I'm not sure I'm going to put huge stock into that because, again, I think if Fnatic does win, they're going to score points the way they normally do, and then Bravado should have a strong showing. But just something to consider that that position has been limited by Movistar. Moving on to the next match, Gamers Origin. Um, this actually should be 3, not 4. So I think this graph is kind of interesting because you see a much more correlated distribution here. And the points that their opponent, Kick, has allowed to each position, both in the EU Masters and over the course of their domestic season, aligns pretty well here. And I think that's because we have a bigger sample size of 3 losses they had in the group stage. So I'm a little more confident in picking out players in a Gamers Origin win based on what we see here. And what we're going to see is that most of the production in a Gamers Origin Series win is going to come from the ADC XD Smiley and also the mid Chukui. I'm probably butchering that, but so those 2 positions are where I'd expect the majority of the production for Gamers Origin to come from in a win. All right, moving on finally to Kick, the team that everybody loves to watch. The ADC Pookie Style and the jungler Zlatan have been the high performers in Kick wins. The remaining 3 positions, as you can see, are basically all averaging around 30 points in wins. So I think that does make Raxo a nice value and someone to pair with Pookie Style because he is the cheapest player on the team. Another important note in terms of what their opponent Gamers Origin allow is that during their 2 losses in the group stage and over the course of their domestic season, they allow the most fantasy points in losses to the jungler position. So I think that bodes really nicely for Zlatan here, particularly when you consider that I think most people are going to be drawn to perhaps captaining Pookie Style in a Kick stack. So the pivot to Zlatan could provide a little leverage, especially since he could certainly be the highest scorer for Kick over the course of a series. All right, that's going to wrap it up. Like I said, I think it's tough to predict the way these matches are going to go today, and that's just the way the EU Masters have been. But I'm going to have exposure to all 4 teams today, and I'm just going to focus on getting the right exposure to those teams based on the metrics that I've gone through. So good luck out there today. I do think that there's a 2-game slate for the semifinal on Saturday, but I can't confirm that just yet. So if that is the case, I will be back with a video before Saturday. But until then, good luck out there today.